You know that feeling when the world you thought you understood suddenly unravels, thread by thread, leaving chaos in its wake? That was me, just trying to live my life with my daughters after everything I'd been through. I'm Evelyn Clark, Evie to my friends, and this story is about the week I turned the tables on my ex-mother-in-law, exposing decades of manipulation, lies, and cruelty in front of her entire church community. But to really understand what happened, you have to understand the backstory, the tangled web of betrayal, grief, and family drama that led up to that moment. My ex-husband passed away unexpectedly last year. He was 46, I was 46, and he left behind not only the daughters we shared, but also 2 boys from an affair he had kept hidden for years. Yes, while he was married to me, he had another family. And yes, my daughters, my eldest at 17 and my youngest at 15, discovered it all. The heartbreak, the betrayal, the legal and emotional fallout, it changed everything. Before his death, I had been in the middle of divorcing him because of this affair. I wasn't hiding anything. My daughters knew the truth, and we'd been seeing a therapist to process the trauma. But his parents? Oh, they didn't take it well. They had spent decades trying to mold my daughters into what they thought good Christian grandchildren should be, and suddenly their world was shattered. And instead of empathy, they decided to manipulate, intimidate, and harass. Over the months following his passing, they attempted all sorts of tactics to gain control, suggesting custody battles, trying to insinuate themselves into our home, making veiled threats, and emotional manipulation disguised as concern. My daughters hated it, and I, as their mother, knew the boundaries that could never be crossed. These women, my ex-mother-in-law especially, had made a habit of invading our lives, and I was done letting them control the narrative. We lived in a town with a weekend market, a small but lively community hub. Farmers brought their produce, meats, eggs, and crafts, and it was a place I often took my daughters for treats or just to feel normal. The market smelled of fresh bread, earth, and seasonal spices in December. That particular week it was especially meaningful because it was my youngest's birthday. Her party was still a few weeks away, but I wanted to make the day special, a memory that wasn't overshadowed by the sadness of losing her father. I gave her a small budget, enough to pick out whatever she wanted, mostly chocolates, candies, and little trinkets. "Go explore," I said, smiling as she sprinted into the crowd of vendors like a kid in a candy store, literally. My eldest stayed close behind, protective as ever, keeping an eye on her little sister while also helping navigate the maze of stalls. It seemed harmless, joyful, innocent. But little did I know, the very people who had caused so much pain in our lives had decided to make themselves a presence here, at the market, in broad daylight. As my youngest roamed the aisles, I went about browsing, picking up a few items myself. But after an hour, a creeping sense of worry settled in. She was supposed to call if she needed anything, and she hadn't. My phone rang just as I was about to track her down, and I saw her name on the screen. She was crying. Not the kind of tears that come from a scraped knee or minor frustration. These were raw, trembling, full-body sobs. "Mom, there are some people. They're saying awful things about me," she stammered. My heart lurched. I dropped everything and grabbed my eldest, and we rushed through the crowded market, our eyes scanning for her. We found her surrounded by 6 older women, all members of my ex-in-law's church. Their faces were twisted in anger, hands gesturing wildly as they berated my daughter for being unchristian, for refusing to spend time with her paternal grandparents, for being a bad big sister to her infant half-brothers. My daughters were the ones who had uncovered the truth about my ex-husband's affair and the children born from it. Trauma and grief shaped their feelings. They weren't cruel, just protective of themselves and wary of the chaos that had infiltrated our lives. I moved between them and my daughter, trying to create a shield with my own body. "Go pay for what you got, sweetie. Go to the car," I whispered to my eldest, who obediently helped her sister gather her items while keeping an eye on the women. Then I turned to the women. Oh, did I turn? I let every ounce of my anger, frustration, and righteous indignation spill over. I reminded them of boundaries, of decency, and of the irrelevance of their opinions over my daughter's well-being. One woman sneered. "You're failing to obey your ex-in-laws like a good Christian wife." Barf. I swallowed my fury, my voice dripping with calm but lethal precision. And yet somehow, you think this makes you moral? Let me clarify. It doesn't. The crowd at the market began to notice. Voices raised. Shoppers whispered, confused by the commotion. Eventually, the market staff asked us to leave, the women trailing us like vultures. I managed to herd my girls into the car, slammed the doors, and drove away, the icy December wind whipping through the streets as I caught my breath. By the time we got home, they were quiet, still shaking but safe, and I had a plan forming in my mind. My ex-mother-in-law had crossed a line, not just with my daughters, but with me. And I wasn't going to let her distort the truth to her church community. I knew what she had posted online. A fabricated tale of our cruelty, our supposed neglect, our alleged rejection of the poor boys she and her husband were convinced should be at the center of everyone's sympathy. But I also knew I had the evidence. I remembered every text, every email, every conversation where they bullied, harassed, and manipulated. And that's when I decided to create something unforgettable, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. I would expose the truth, not in anger, but with precision, clarity, and undeniable proof. And the stage for this? Their church community. The same people they thought would unquestioningly support them. And that, dear listener, is where the real story begins. The next morning, I woke with a tight knot in my stomach. The memory of my youngest's terrified face and the women shouting at her still lingered. Coffee in hand, I tried to shake the lingering unease. How could anyone think it was okay to corner a teenager and berate her for something she had no control over, for refusing to accept the manipulations of adults who had caused untold pain? But the day wasn't going to wait for me to calm down. The market was open, the streets bustling, and my daughters were anxious but brave. My eldest insisted she would accompany her sister again, and I, torn between wanting to supervise and giving them space, finally agreed. Sometimes stepping back allowed them to take small acts of independence. And besides, I had a plan forming. We arrived at the weekend market, sunlight glinting off the tents and the early morning frost sparkling like diamonds on the produce. Vendors shouted over each other, extolling the freshness of their apples or the fluffiness of their pastries. There was an almost festive quality to the chaos, and yet, beneath it, I felt a simmering tension. My youngest clutched her birthday budget tightly, her fingers white around the small wad of cash. She was excited but cautious, and then, just as I suspected, the same group of women appeared. My stomach twisted. They had clearly been watching, waiting for another opportunity to lecture, intimidate, and manipulate. I felt my pulse quicken, but this time I was prepared. I held my daughters close, positioning them behind me. "Not today," I murmured under my breath. "Not in my presence." The women spotted us immediately, their faces lighting up with cruel glee. "Ah, there she is," one of them called out, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. "Your daughter, so independent, so ungrateful, so unchristian." My youngest shrank back slightly, trying to move past them, but they formed a semicircle around her. The eldest stepped forward, protective, and I could see the flash of fear in my youngest's eyes. Fear mingled with righteous indignation. "You have no idea what you're talking about," I said sharply, stepping forward. My voice carried authority, calm but unwavering. "She is a teenager. She is my daughter. And none of you have the right to corner her, intimidate her, or make her feel guilty for the sins of her father, or the sins of yours." One of the women scoffed, crossing her arms. "She refuses her grandparents? She refuses her duties. How can a child deny what God has ordained?" I felt the blood rush to my head. "Ordained? Really? Duties?" I repeated. "Her only duty is to herself, to her own heart and her own safety. Your so-called moral lessons do not override the trauma inflicted upon her. And as for God, perhaps he prefers love over manipulation, truth over deceit, and protecting children over punishing them for standing up for themselves." The crowd of shoppers began to notice. Whispers rose, some expressions curious, others judgmental. But I didn't care. My focus was my daughters, their safety, and the words that needed to be said. "Your actions," I continued, pointing toward the women one by one, "have caused this child distress. You have twisted faith into a weapon. You have leveraged guilt, shame, and fear as if they were your property. And now you will leave her alone." A sharp laugh from one of them earned a glare from me. "Do you think this is funny?" I asked, voice rising. "Do you? Because what you call funny is harassment. What you call discipline is emotional abuse. And I will not allow it. Not in public, not in private, not ever." For a moment, it seemed like they might retreat. But then one of the older women, the self-appointed ringleader, spat out a venomous line. "You are failing as a mother. You are failing as a Christian. You are the reason these children are ungrateful, and your husband." I cut her off, my own voice now a weapon of controlled fury. Do not speak of my husband. Not in that tone, not with that lie. He betrayed us. He abandoned us, and his choices are not my daughter's responsibility." At this point, my eldest daughter had stepped behind me, clutching my hand tightly. I felt her fear, but also her trust, and it strengthened my resolve. "We will not tolerate your judgment," I said. "And you will not follow us. And if you do, the law may become involved, because harassment is harassment, whether clothed in faith or not." The women sneered, but I could see the first flicker of hesitation. My daughters were protected, shielded by my presence, and by the sheer moral force of standing up to them. I knew that if I kept calm, spoke clearly, and did not allow my anger to tip into chaos, I could assert dominance without violence. "Now," I said, lowering my voice but letting it carry across the small crowd that had gathered, "we are leaving. You will not follow. You will not speak to my children again in public. And you will reconsider what you call morality before confronting innocent teenagers." By now, several vendors had stopped to watch. Some whispered, "Wow, she's right." Others looked uneasy at the confrontation. And one by one the women began to back off, their smugness replaced by irritation and a flicker of fear. Fear of social exposure, of being called out in a public space, of the ripple effects that could follow. We moved quickly through the stalls, gathering my youngest's purchases. My eldest held the bag while I kept a vigilant eye on the retreating women. My hands were trembling, not with fear this time, but with adrenaline and satisfaction. The confrontation was over. For now. When we reached the car, I breathed deeply, feeling the tension in my shoulders start to release. My daughters were shaken but unharmed, and that mattered more than anything. I started the engine, and as we pulled away, the women lingered behind, like shadows fading into the morning sun. Once home, the quiet of our living room felt like a sanctuary. I made hot chocolate for my daughters and sat with them, letting them share their emotions. My youngest cried again, this time in relief rather than fear, as she described the threats and accusations hurled at her. My eldest held her sister close, whispering words of comfort. And then, after they calmed, I opened my laptop. The church's social media page. I needed to understand exactly what narrative was being spread about us. And there it was, a long, meticulously crafted post by my ex-mother-in-law. The tale she had spun was designed to paint me and my daughters as cruel, uncaring, unchristian, and selfish. She claimed we had abandoned her and her husband, accused us of rejecting the boys, and twisted reality to make herself and her husband into tragic victims. I felt my jaw tighten. Every lie, every misrepresentation, every attempt to shame us into submission. I remembered the texts, the emails, the conversations. I remembered the moments of cruelty that had been catalogued over months and years. And an idea began to form, sharp and precise. If she wanted to play dirty in public, I could match her, and do it in a way that could not be ignored. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a sense of clarity. Not revenge, not out of anger, but justice. And that justice would be meticulous, undeniable, and public. That evening, after tucking my daughters into bed and making sure they felt safe, I finally sat down at my laptop. The house was quiet, the only sounds the soft hum of the heater and the occasional creak of settling floorboards. I needed to see exactly what had been happening while I was away at the market, and what my ex-mother-in-law had posted. Her Facebook post in the church group was long, dramatic, and filled with every ounce of exaggeration she could muster. According to her, I and my daughters were cold, cruel, and ungrateful. We were leaving her and my ex-father-in-law penniless, denying them the love and respect they deserved, and somehow causing the orphaned boys, my ex's affair children, to suffer. The post was carefully crafted to manipulate the more extreme, judgmental members of the congregation. I scrolled slowly, letting the absurdity sink in. The accusations were bizarre. I didn't want the boys because they were boys. I was refusing to care for them, and somehow my very existence was an offense to God. And yet, woven into the post were just enough self-pitying flourishes that the more sympathetic members of the church had rallied in support of my ex-in-laws. Comments poured in, praying for them. "We are here for you," and "such suffering in our community." I had to fight back, but carefully. The church was strict about moral behavior, especially when it came to fidelity and honesty. Cheating was a cardinal sin in their eyes, and my ex-mother-in-law had bent the truth so far it teetered on self-exoneration while hiding the affair entirely. But I had all the evidence. Every photo, text message, and email documenting my ex-husband's infidelity, my ex-in-law's complicity, and the harassment of my daughters had been meticulously saved. This wasn't about drama. It was about truth. I spent hours organizing the files. Each document, each image, each text conversation had to be presented in a way that would be undeniable and shocking to the congregation, yet not legally jeopardize me. My daughters were my priority, and I had to ensure that the exposure would protect them, not further traumatize them. By the next morning, I had a plan. I would create personalized binders that resembled the church's hymn or prayer booklets. Each binder would contain evidence, neatly arranged, easy to review, and impossible to ignore. The first page of each binder would feature a striking photo. My ex-husband and his affair partner, clearly identifiable in our living room, his betrayal laid bare. Below the image in bold letters, I wrote their names and the phrase, "Love story." The rest of the binder contained supporting documents, text messages, emails, and photos of harassment toward my daughters, all labeled clearly with dates and context. The binders were designed for maximum impact. They looked innocuous, like church materials, but inside, they carried the full weight of truth. I wanted the congregation to see everything: the manipulation, the lies, the hypocrisy. I didn't want revenge. I wanted justice and accountability. I arrived at the church early, careful to blend in with the congregation. At the back, near the desk where songbooks and hymnals were stored for those who needed them, I quietly placed the binders. No one noticed. They looked like ordinary materials, ready to be picked up by anyone in the congregation. I stepped back and observed, waiting for the ripple effect. It didn't take long. By mid-service, the gossip mill had spun into overdrive. People whispered in corners, flipping through the binders with wide eyes. The reactions were immediate: shock, disbelief, outrage. Names were mentioned in hushed tones, and I could hear snippets of conversations. "I can't believe this. They've been lying to us all along. How could they do this to those children?" And then the online component kicked in. Church members began sharing screenshots and photographs of the binders in private messages, creating a cascade of information that reached even those who hadn't attended service. The Facebook group erupted. My ex-mother-in-law's carefully constructed narrative crumbled under the weight of evidence. Members who had supported her began apologizing to me and my daughters, acknowledging the manipulation and harassment. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had built her image on pity and moral superiority, and yet, in her attempt to shame me, she had exposed herself. The pastor even had to intervene to keep the conversations within bounds, urging members to remain respectful and avoid overtly cruel language. The tension was palpable, but the truth had won. Later, I reflected on the events with a mix of relief and empowerment. This wasn't about public humiliation for its own sake. It was about ensuring that justice, truth, and protection prevailed over lies, manipulation, and abuse. My daughters could see that standing up, even against seemingly insurmountable odds, could produce real change. The episode also reinforced a vital lesson. Systems, whether religious or secular, respond when presented with clear, undeniable evidence. Manipulation and lies only hold power as long as they remain unchecked. Once the truth is visible, even the most insular and biased communities are compelled to act or face their own credibility unraveling. By the end of the week, the atmosphere in our household had shifted. My daughters felt safer, validated, and proud of the steps taken to protect them. The ex-in-law's influence had diminished, and I finally felt a sense of closure, not only for my children, but also for myself. The binders, carefully constructed, had done their work. Justice had been served. The church community, despite its quirks and flaws, had demonstrated that accountability was possible. And in that there was hope. Hope that truth, courage, and careful planning could overcome manipulation, harassment, and even decades of misplaced loyalty. I knew this was only the beginning of a longer journey. Our lives were far from simple, and my daughter's healing and safety remained ongoing concerns. But for now, a weight had been lifted. The binders, innocuous in appearance yet powerful in content, had shifted the balance. What once seemed like an unstoppable force of harassment and deceit had been checked, and it was profoundly satisfying. The next Sunday, I returned to church feeling a mix of anticipation and cautious optimism. I wasn't sure what I'd walk into. The reactions to the binders had been fast online, but seeing it in person would be different. Would the congregation be calm and reflective, or would the tension be palpable? As I entered, I noticed immediate changes. People who had previously greeted me with polite indifference now approached with quiet, sincere smiles. A few whispered, "We saw the binders. We had no idea." Others simply nodded, a gesture of solidarity and understanding. The shift in the atmosphere was subtle but unmistakable. For once, the moral compass of the congregation seemed pointed in the right direction. I spotted a few of my ex-in-laws near the back, trying desperately to blend in, their faces tight with forced composure. Their usual posture of superiority had crumbled. I could feel the eyes of the congregation subtly following them, watching for any sign of impropriety. It was as though the church itself had become an invisible jury. I took a seat near the middle, close enough to observe without being conspicuous. The pastor began the service with a tone of gentle admonition, referencing integrity, accountability, and the importance of truth in every community. His words carried extra weight that day, because everyone knew what had transpired. The message was clear: deceit has consequences, and no amount of social standing or history can shield one from accountability. During the hymns, I noticed a few people flipping through the binders that had been left out. Some glanced nervously, others with a mix of shock and anger. Conversations were whispered but carried a certain urgency. "Can you believe what they did? All this time, and we were none the wiser. I never thought we'd see the truth laid out like this." Meanwhile, my ex-in-laws sat rigidly, their hands tightly clasped, eyes darting around the room. They avoided eye contact with anyone. I could almost hear the internal panic. This wasn't the support they had anticipated. This was judgment, subtle but undeniable. After the service, members approached me individually. Some offered heartfelt apologies for not recognizing the harassment earlier. Others thanked me for my courage in presenting evidence clearly and respectfully. The words were sincere, validating not just my actions, but also the trauma my daughters had endured. One member, someone I had known casually for years, leaned in and said quietly, "You didn't just protect your children. You reminded all of us what real accountability looks like." By contrast, my ex-in-laws tried to make small talk with a few acquaintances, but their efforts were awkward and transparent. They were met with polite nods and firm boundaries, people clearly wary of aligning with them after the revelations. The church's strict adherence to moral behavior, particularly regarding infidelity and honesty, meant they couldn't simply gloss over the evidence. Their social capital had taken a hit. Later, I learned through whispers and discreet messages that the binders had become a talking point in every group meeting and committee within the church. Even the youth leaders, who normally focused on fundraising and events, had started referencing the binders as a cautionary example. The importance of honesty, the consequences of deception, and the moral responsibility to protect the vulnerable. What struck me most was how quickly the narrative had flipped. Before, my ex-in-laws had been the victims in the eyes of some members, elderly, grieving, supposedly mistreated. Now the focus had shifted. They were the ones accountable for abuse and manipulation. The congregation's response wasn't vindictive. It was corrective. People were learning, reflecting, and importantly, taking protective action to ensure this type of harassment couldn't recur. Back at home, I discussed the events with my daughters. Their reactions were a mix of relief, amazement, and cautious optimism. They had been terrified at the market, harassed by people who claimed moral authority over their lives. Now, they could see that standing up, documenting evidence, and using the system thoughtfully had real-world effects. They were learning the value of courage paired with strategy, an invaluable lesson for two teenage girls navigating complex family dynamics. As the week progressed, I received several messages from church members I hadn't interacted with in years. People I barely knew were expressing gratitude and offering support for my daughters. They praised the way I had handled the situation, not with rage, but with calculated clarity and moral fortitude. Some even asked how they could ensure their own children were protected from similar harassment. The binders had created a ripple effect, spreading awareness and accountability throughout the congregation. Of course, my ex-in-laws didn't take this quietly. I noticed subtle attempts to reclaim their reputation, posts expressing confusion, lamenting their alienation, and painting themselves as misunderstood elders. But by now the truth was embedded. Even sympathetic members had seen the evidence, and the weight of proof was undeniable. Their attempts at self-victimization fell flat against the documents, photographs, and messages I had carefully curated. One particularly amusing moment occurred when my ex-mother-in-law tried to organize a small prayer circle, ostensibly to seek solace and guidance. Instead of support, she was met with awkward silence, polite nods, and gentle but firm refusal to participate. Even her closest friends within the church had distanced themselves, unwilling to endorse her narrative in the face of overwhelming evidence. The social dynamics of the congregation had shifted completely. My ex-in-laws were no longer figures of authority or moral guidance, they were cautionary examples. People were watching them, assessing their behavior, and choosing integrity over loyalty to family. The binders had not only exposed their wrongdoing, but also subtly reshaped the ethical landscape of the church itself. In parallel, I began receiving subtle acknowledgments from the pastor and church leadership. Private messages expressed appreciation for my careful handling of the evidence and the courage it took to confront deception in such a public and potentially volatile environment. They recognized that the goal wasn't humiliation but accountability, protection of the vulnerable, and education of the congregation. Meanwhile, the Facebook group had become a hub of reflection and dialogue. Members shared their own stories of family conflict, moral dilemmas, and challenges navigating ethical responsibilities. My daughters, now shielded from harassment, became inadvertent symbols of resilience. People discussed ways to protect young members from bullying, manipulation, and false narratives, often referencing the binders as a turning point. For my ex-in-laws, the consequences continued to unfold in unexpected ways. Invitations to social events dwindled, leadership opportunities were rescinded, and the weight of public awareness within their own community was constant. They could no longer manipulate or control narratives without scrutiny. Every action they took was now observed through a lens of accountability. Through all this, I maintained a quiet sense of satisfaction. This wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring that truth, fairness, and protection prevailed. My daughters had learned firsthand that integrity matters, that courage paired with strategy can create tangible change, and that sometimes the most effective way to confront harassment is with evidence and calm resolve. By the end of the month, the binders had become legendary within certain circles of the church. People referenced them as examples in sermons, youth meetings, and even informal gatherings. They were a symbol of moral clarity and protective action. Meanwhile, my ex-in-laws' attempts to reassert dominance were largely ignored, their social credibility irreparably damaged. The broader lesson was clear. Standing up against abuse, even in complex family situations, requires courage, preparation, and a strategic approach. Simply confronting someone verbally rarely suffices. Documenting, presenting, and leveraging systems of accountability can transform outcomes. For my daughters and me, life slowly returned to a sense of normalcy. The trauma of harassment, while still emotionally present, was mitigated by the knowledge that we had taken decisive action. Our relationship strengthened, grounded in trust, protection, and shared understanding of how to navigate complicated, often hostile environments. Even months later, I would hear snippets of gossip, often tinged with awe or disbelief, about the binders and the impact they had. My daughters understood that while family and social dynamics can be cruel, thoughtful, principled action can redirect outcomes. They saw firsthand that accountability, when pursued correctly, is both empowering and transformative. The church, once a place of potential manipulation and pressure, had become a stage for justice and moral clarity. Through careful planning, evidence, and courage, we had reshaped the narrative, protected vulnerable individuals, and reminded everyone, adults and teens alike, that integrity matters above all else. After the church exposure, life settled into a quieter rhythm, but the lessons from that weekend lingered in every corner of my mind. The initial relief and vindication had faded into a deeper understanding of family, accountability, and the sometimes subtle power of action. For my daughters and me, this chapter wasn't just about conflict. It was about survival, resilience, and reclaiming control over our own narrative. My daughters, still recovering from the emotional trauma of the harassment, began to express themselves more openly. For years, they had internalized the tension and guilt imposed by my ex-in-laws. They had carried the weight of accusations that were not theirs, blamed for things beyond their comprehension, judged for choices made in response to adult betrayal. After witnessing the congregation's reaction, they saw the world could recognize injustice when presented with clarity and proof. Their sense of self-worth strengthened, and their trust in me deepened. One evening, while we were sitting at the kitchen table sharing tea, my youngest looked up at me and said, "Mom, I never thought anyone would believe us, but now, people saw the truth, and they sided with us." Her words were simple, yet the weight of them settled in my chest. I realized that in addition to defending my daughters in the moment, I had given them a lesson that would resonate for life. That truth, courage, and careful action can counter manipulation. I reflected on the steps that led us to this point. Every detail, the documentation, the binders, the strategic presentation at church, had mattered. A casual confrontation at the market might have escalated into yelling or threats, but by using evidence and thoughtfulness, the harassment was countered effectively and permanently. It was a lesson in the importance of method over impulse. The church, once a space of potential manipulation, had become a classroom in ethics and integrity. Members had witnessed firsthand that moral authority isn't automatically conferred by age, status, or relationship. Accountability was visible, undeniable, and measurable. My ex-in-laws, who had attempted to assert control through guilt and selective storytelling, were now the cautionary tale. Even within their own community, respect and trust had eroded. Their position of influence, cultivated over decades, crumbled under the weight of truth. I also noted the broader social impact. Church members who had previously been passive or indifferent began engaging in discussions about boundaries, ethical behavior, and family accountability. Conversations that might have once been whispered in hallways became open dialogue about fairness, integrity, and protection of the vulnerable. Parents began reevaluating how they discussed family conflict with their children. Youth leaders examined how they mentored teens facing complex issues, and the congregation collectively absorbed the importance of evidence-backed truth. For me, the practical implications were clear. Documentation was not just a tool for confrontation, it was protection. Whether in personal disputes, legal matters, or community interactions, having a clear record of events, communications, and actions could transform outcomes. The binders were more than proof. They were a shield, a means of ensuring that manipulation, harassment, and lies could not prevail. This episode also illuminated the emotional intelligence required in such situations. Confrontation without planning can lead to chaos and emotional injury, but confrontation with evidence, strategy, and calm intent can lead to resolution, accountability, and even moral education for those involved. My daughters watched, learned, and absorbed these subtle yet profound lessons about navigating complexity with integrity. In the weeks that followed, the social dynamics around us shifted permanently. My ex-in-law's attempts to regain influence failed repeatedly. Invitations to community events dwindled. Subtle glances and polite distances replaced the warm greetings they had once expected. Even casual acquaintances within the congregation seemed cautious, aware that previous assumptions about loyalty and moral judgment were no longer reliable. The binders, in their quiet yet deliberate presence, had rewritten the social landscape. Meanwhile, my daughters began to reclaim small freedoms that had been restricted by fear and intimidation. Weekend outings became more relaxed, conversations more open, and hobbies that had been shelved resurfaced with joy. Their smiles were no longer tinged with apprehension. They understood that protection and agency could coexist with trust and independence. I also recognized the subtle victories in myself. The process of taking careful, principled action had changed how I approached challenges. Where I might have once reacted with anger or fear, I now understood the value of preparation, evidence, and strategic communication. Courage was not about explosive confrontation. It was about measured steps, clarity of purpose, and moral resolve. Looking back, I saw the binders not as instruments of revenge, but as instruments of clarity. They distilled complex, emotionally charged events into tangible narratives that were difficult to dispute. They made the truth visible, undeniable, and actionable. And in doing so, they protected my daughters, educated a community, and held accountable those who had attempted to manipulate, harass, or deceive. Even months later, I would hear echoes of the event, discreet remarks, reflective conversations, and subtle acknowledgments of the courage and precision involved. These reminders weren't about pride or recognition. They were about understanding that thoughtful, principled action can create ripples far beyond the initial conflict. The personal lessons extended beyond the church or family. Life, in general, often presents challenges where power imbalances exist, where truth is obscured by ego or self-interest, and where vulnerable individuals are at risk. I had learned that preparation, evidence, and measured action can tilt outcomes toward justice, protection, and moral clarity. These lessons became part of the toolkit I shared with my daughters, ensuring they could navigate complex situations with both confidence and integrity. I also reflected on forgiveness and reconciliation, not as absolution for wrongdoing, but as personal liberation from bitterness. My ex-in-law's actions had been hurtful and damaging, yet dwelling on resentment would only perpetuate harm. By focusing on strategic action, evidence, and community accountability, I achieved resolution and protection without being consumed by anger. Forgiveness, in this context, was about freeing ourselves while letting consequences naturally unfold. The broader moral takeaway was clear. Integrity requires action. Moral or ethical truths cannot exist in isolation. They need advocates who will defend them, document them, and communicate them effectively. Silence, even with good intentions, often allows manipulation, abuse, or deception to flourish. By stepping forward, providing evidence, and holding others accountable, we not only protect ourselves, but contribute to the moral fabric of our communities. In the quiet moments after these events, my daughters and I reflected together. We discussed the importance of boundaries, the necessity of documenting interactions, and the value of calm, strategic responses to conflict. We reinforced that courage does not always roar. It sometimes whispers in the form of a careful phone call, a binder of evidence, or a thoughtfully crafted message. The lessons were practical, emotional, and ethical, equipping them for challenges far beyond the immediate family drama. Looking back, I also realized the subtle shifts in my personal philosophy. Life is rarely fair. Family dynamics are rarely straightforward, and institutions that claim moral authority can sometimes fail to protect the vulnerable. Yet the combination of preparation, evidence, and moral clarity can create transformative outcomes. Small, deliberate actions, when executed with integrity, can ripple outward in ways that are both powerful and protective. Ultimately, the story of my daughters and me, the ex-in-laws, and the church became a case study in accountability, strategy, and courage. It wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring truth, fairness, and protection prevailed in a situation fraught with emotional, ethical, and social complexities. It was about demonstrating to my daughters, and to the community, that integrity matters, even when inconvenient, uncomfortable, or unpopular. And so, as life returned to a semblance of normalcy, the lessons endured. My daughters grew stronger, more confident, and more attuned to the nuances of human behavior and morality. I grew wiser in understanding how to navigate challenges with grace, strategy, and resolve. The binders, the careful documentation, the church exposure. They were not just events in a story. They were catalysts for long-lasting personal and community transformation. If there's a final takeaway, it's this. Courage is measured not by fury but by thoughtfulness. Action guided by integrity can protect, educate, and transform. And even in the most painful or complex family conflicts, careful strategy can turn vulnerability into empowerment. For my daughters, this meant safety, respect, and affirmation. For the church, it meant a reckoning with morality, integrity, and accountability. And for me, it meant the satisfaction of having taken principled action, knowing that truth and courage had triumphed. Not through aggression, but through clarity, preparation, and moral resolve. The story isn't just about exposing wrongdoing, it's about ensuring that accountability is visible, education is ongoing, and that vulnerable individuals are protected. It's about proving that small, deliberate, principled actions can indeed change lives, shift narratives, and restore justice. Stories like these remind us that ordinary actions can have extraordinary consequences. Subscribe now and join me for more real-life lessons and surprises.